Welcome everyone to today's discussion with Sam Conniff Allende on his wonderful book, Be More Pirate. Right. So as always, we will start with some introductions and then we will take it from there. There is no specific agenda today. We will expect lots and lots of questions to be presented to Sam. But just before we start, some ground rules. We are always respectful of each other's views. As you know that this session is being recorded, so if you don't want your face to be recorded, you can turn off the camera. Please use chat for ideas and questions, but you can also unmute yourself and ask questions to Sam anytime. As we have been, we would encourage you to talk between the meetings. As you know that we do 3 meetings for every book. So we encourage you to talk between meetings, either on our meetup page or the LinkedIn page. And please do send feedback and suggestions on how we can improve the book club, or what books would you like us to read in the book club. Next book after this one, I will talk about it at the end, but it will be Turn Your Ship Around, and I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end later. Right, so let's get started. Nick, over to you.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Lambro. I work at the University of Westminster. I am a colleague of Himanshu, and we've got the book club, and we are quite proud of it. And we are always thankful for the authors, both for writing the books and also coming in to talk about them with us. We are a project management book club. Therefore, we do take a project management view of whatever is happening. And we love books ourselves. And in this particular case, we are a bit slightly confused because there's a second book that we're still struggling to read ourselves. And therefore, thank you very much for that. The how-to is a nice title in itself. And we'll just talk. We have been talking twice about the book, and we've been liking it very much. So I think that's all about me. Too much, actually.
Okay, great. So let's start. So let me open the floor to our readers. Are there any questions that you would like to ask this time to Sam? Christina, I'm sure you have a few questions.
Hello, I have a question, if you don't mind, and I think it's a quite appropriate one. And I work for a CX-centric organization. As sort of a direct language from my organization, we could say that all our products are centered around the customer. So we believe in the age of the customer. And the book is particularly relevant to me because it mentions consumers as well. But my question is, how did the idea with the pirates begin? Is it the Steve Jobs quote that inspired you, Sam, to research about pirates and that to sort of draw these connections?
Sam, you're on mute, I think.
Good point. Hello, Zaklina, good question. And thank you for pulling out the point about consumers and how we think about them. And I think the point I was drawing in the book is that thinking about them in a form of citizens changes our thinking. And I'll come back to that point because I might have a recommendation for a future book for you. Where it came from originally, I'd spent, as you know, because you've read it, by that point, 15 years of my life running a social enterprise. And I was trying to create platforms for young people. And it became really clear to me that the systems that provide social benefit, and even in the terminology, they refer to them as beneficiaries, beneficiary itself just denotes how patronizing those and paternalistic those organizations often unintentionally become. And after 15 years of running this organization, I just got so frustrated at where change comes from. And it wasn't down to the youth workers, it's not down to the teachers, it's not down to the people who run prisons, it's not down to the people who run refugee centers. Yet all of these were places that I went to and saw how hard people were working. And over 15 years, change just wasn't happening. You know, what are we going to do? What are we? And ultimately, when the change is inhibited for systemic reasons, you know, we have baked unfairness, we have designed unfairness into our systems, and then we try to tackle unfairness on a non-systematic way. You know, it just doesn't work. And then we end up, the individuals take on the responsibility for diversity. There's a classic disparity and inequality that's common business parlance. Or we've been talking a lot about resilience the last few years. Again, there's not a business that doesn't have a resilience practitioner or some kind of strategy in play. But in both of these, we mistake the vulnerabilities of the organization that is designed to be unequal and is designed to put pressure on the individuals. So in my ultimate frustration, I realized I couldn't create change from the position that I was then in. So my desire to like advocate for this and write something that pointed this out, you know, I couldn't bear to go to another innovation event where we just write things on the walls and those post-it notes would end up going nowhere and good ideas are sent to die in email threads. And but, you know, I needed the independence to kind of call out this willful blindness to the systemic inability for change. And so I began writing to try and capture all this. And to be honest, I probably wrote the world's most boring book. It was called Purpose First. And it was about how if we make value-based decisions, we can move past the kind of the awakening of purpose in inverted commas in business over the last couple of years. I support fully, but I think again, you know, it'd be very easy for that not to have as deeper effect as we would like it to be. And I think if I'm really honest, as I knew I was going to be leaving the organization, I was having a bit of an identity crisis. And I thought if I wrote a really clever sounding book, it would help position me as a bit of an intellectual and what would my next thing be? Anyway, I got 20,000 words in. I got Penguin interested as an author. I felt like I had a pretty good position to argue the shift that's needed within in business and why it's systemic and has to be in the direction of values and transparency and purpose. And then a bit like the picture you see here, my life has always been lived in the open. I've always workshopped every single idea I've ever done. I've believed in co-creation and co-production. I believe in the messiness of success and getting stuff done. I am not a natural project manager. I'm a project manager's nightmare. And so taking my manuscript and beginning to workshop it and explain it to rooms full of people, to entrepreneurs, to people in large organizations. And the people who knew me said, Sam, what's happened to you? Why are you so boring? Where's all your usual stories and caricatures and invocations and rocket ships and pirates? And as I said it, I realized I've been using pirates as a metaphor throughout my adult life. And I couldn't really tell you why, other than that spirit of rebellion that you can tell I'm passionate about. And so I began to question and I went back to my desk and I thought, I've really got to rewrite this material. It's really boring. And it's kind of exactly the business book that I didn't want to write. But you know how it is. We all try to be the grown-up that we think is the appropriate person in the room. And because I was writing a book in inverted commas, because it was publishing, because I felt such imposter syndrome, I thought I had to write an intelligent and grown-up book. I went back to my desk and there on my note was, what about the pirates? And I kept seeing it for a couple of weeks. And then I went to the British Museum and started doing some research on why do I call out pirates? And I went to the Greenwich Maritime Museum. And then I began to uncover the truth and the story that you see in the book. And with every single document I found, with every newspaper article, with everything that began to make it really clear that this story was the true story, I just simply couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that hadn't been told before. And then actually became a race against, in my head, someone else who was, because the story is so fantastic, right? It's not my story, but I pulled the thread of it. I had to get it out in the world. And the Steve Jobs quote is there because there's someone I admire, and they clearly capture the modern spirit of piracy that I'm trying to equate the book to. And so when I was pitching the book, and I'll finish the story here, when I was pitching the book to Penguin, and I got the design that I wanted for the front cover, you all know what it's like when you're pitching an idea, you're willing to pretty much say anything. And so I put what would be an absolutely ideal quote on the front cover, which was the Steve Jobs quote. And I realized about 2 months into the design process that the creative director at Penguin assumed that I had permission from the Steve Jobs estate to use the quote. So I just kept my mouth shut on that one. So I'm very proud that I'm flying the Steve Jobs flag on the front, but it's very much unofficial. And the backstory, yeah, is absolutely me writing the far more boring version of a book about change.
And actually, there is another wonderful quote in the book at the very beginning that well, if you ask anyone that their grandfather is a pirate, they would be really, really proud. I think so. There is that sort of innate kind of thing in all of us to be that rebel. And I think your book sort of brings that out and actually makes people think in different ways.
And I've always found that quote to be entirely true. The things there's been an interesting challenge around ancestors, because there is, you know, and in the book, obviously, I'm very much depending on moral relativism and historic relativism, and something that seemed okay then does not seem okay now. And I think in the last 2 years, a lot of people who haven't thought about their ancestors have to think again. And there can't be that many rooms, you know, family photos that go back 3 or more generations in England where there isn't an overlap with slavery, with the stages of the empire, and the money that was made in the world that we now live in. And so calling out those aspects of our past and comparing them to where we are now, yeah, I couldn't believe more in that quote than I do now. And I find myself still completely, you know, blown away by the relevance of the idea of contrasting the rebel and the rule breaker, retelling that story of old and then pulling out and finding the pirates of the moment. I've just completed another large piece of work where project management is absolutely essential. It's a financial services operation. And it's just incredible to see how mired in rules we get, and how that spirit that you would be proud that your grandfather was a pirate, that it's an ancestral connection that, although morally dubious, holds some weight, and is enabling people in huge, large matrixed organizations to create change. And we know how hard that can be.
Indeed, but it has been quite difficult to associate with pirates as a role model, and you do a very good job to actually explain what you're doing. And it is sort of on page 118, you say that even if it was more by default than design, pirates created an organizational model that was clearly ahead of the time. And if we think about East India Company and all the other in slavery and how the Navy was at that time, then it is very clear that the pirates have stumbled on an idea of diverse and highly responsive to its members. And I'm reading your lines, I'm not making them up myself. And I thought that bringing the pirates in also brought in the romanticism. You do mention books that I have been buying because of you and all that. And also you are influencing a lot of people. The reason that we found your book was because we did the Change Ninja book, which is almost born by your ideas, which we found quite fascinating and all that. So there's many things to thank you for.
I like that. I like that very much. I know of Change Ninja, and what is remarkable, and I probably should be as proud of, because it's what I ascertain in the book, that notion that, as you just called out, pirates weren't necessarily, they were clearly ahead of their time, but they weren't necessarily doing this by design, yes, by default. But their ability and their desire to make a change that was right for them, and to do so based on values, fairness, principles, and livelihoods, then resonates. And it's that, you know, you can claim a correlation to the changes that took place over history as a result. You can't argue for causal influence. And then I've got to see that back. I was invited by an organization, global organization, to their Pirate Awards 3 months ago. And I had no idea. You know, they bought the book for every employee 2 years ago. They'd taken it on as an internal moniker. And they had a Pirate of the Month, they had Pirate Campaign, they had Pirate Project Management. And it's incredible. I mean, it's just enlivening to see. And yet at the same time, there's this very strange thing that happens when you work so hard on an idea and you get it to a certain place of fruition, and then you really don't know what happens next until you're very lucky and you hear from people like yourselves or the Change Ninjas when a story comes back to you. So it's a real pleasure to hear that, and then for someone else to help me join the dots of influence that it's had.
If nobody's asking, may I ask you a strange question that is in my mind because of my age? Your name is also Allende, and Allende is the Prime Minister of Chile, and there is a lot of rebellion inside your book itself, and it is clear that what you're looking for would resonate with the president of Chile, who had to die for his own cause at the time. I was obviously a student in the 70s, as you can tell. But then you've dropped the name in the other book. You are just Sam Conniff in the second book. Are you in any way related to the Allende I am talking about?
So the reason I adopted the name Allende was, well, I was a fan of the Allende you mentioned, and also of the author Allende. There are several quite wonderful Allendes, as was the mother of my children, my wife, and she heralds from Mexico, from an area called Oaxaca, which is the southernmost state, the largest, poorest region of Oaxaca. A very beautiful, incredible, it's where all the kind of colors and vibrancy of Frida Kahlo come from. And yet it's also a state that's really division, because it's right on the southern border. It gets a lot of the kind of drug traffic goes through it. Hi, Frida.
Daddy.
Yes, Daddy.
That isn't being really nice.
Isn't she? Well, you guys are going to have to sort that out for yourself. I'll be another 30 minutes and then I'll come and take care of it.
Okay.
Okay. Good girl. And
Okay.
Isn't she wonderful? Yeah, we met in the UK and we had a glorious love affair, and then she had to return to Mexico, and so I went to chase her and declare my love for her, and we got married in Mexico, and then we returned to England and we had our two wonderful children. And upon marriage, I thought the right thing to do would be to adopt her name, because I was in Mexico for the Day of Independence, which is also a fantastic story of rebellion. The Mexican Declaration of Independence is thought to be one of the most democratic documents on earth. Thomas Paine had a hand in authoring it. It overlaps with the American Declaration of Independence. It's used by countless others around the world. Benito Juarez, the first president, was like, that's why Benito Mussolini is called, but there's all these kind of like confusing overlaps of these early really pure ideas of democracy that then get so bastardized over time. Anyway, this all fascinated me. The history of it was so wonderful. I fell in love with Mexico. And on Independence Day, everyone comes out and there's fireworks in the street and gunshots in the air, and they call the names of the 12 rebels who basically led to independence. And one of them is Allende. And I just thought it'd be such a crime for my children not to have the name Allende, when they are half Mexican and this is their heritage, and to go out in the streets and hear your name called as like one of the rebels who led this beautiful country to democracy was just too great. So I adopted that name so that my children would have the double-barreled name. Even though Bibi, their mum, and me are no longer married, we're still very, very good friends, and we co-parent really well. We live just around the corner from each other. And so it was a cultural choice to make sure these children inherit that wonderful, full spirit and history of rebellion and their background. And that's why the name isn't there anymore, because now we're no longer legally married. So I've just returned to my maiden name, my premarital name.
Thank you very much, and I apologize for asking the question now, but I think the answer was beautiful itself.
Yeah, there's nothing to apologize for whatsoever. I am here in the spirit of challenging questions, and And I'm here, very happy to speak personally. The book is dedicated to Scarlett and Frida. They're going to read it and they will question me, and they do question me about the rules of life. You can imagine, as a 9-year-old works out what it means to be a good rule breaker, it's quite something. And so it's always useful, I think, to touch into these topics. So thank you for the question.
And then in that spirit, actually, how do you kind of, I think that is the premise of this whole thing, right? That how do you sort of define good rule breaking? Because there is a very fine line, isn't it, that between good rule breaking, and then of course there is a disclaimer in the book as well that, well, there are other types of pirates, but we are kind of focusing on the good rule breakers and not on the others. So what do you tell people that, because we need to have a really good and open mind for reading this book, and again, I mean, I've personally learned so much. Some of the examples that you have given, some of the organizations that you have mentioned later on in the book as well.
So something that I've learned through the course of How to Be More Pirate, and there's a, whilst we're getting into the behind the surface explanations, the reason I wanted to write How to Be More Pirate was because I was so worried. I was so surprised by the success of the first book, and I was so worried by all these messages that I get from people about how they'd applied it. And I felt irresponsible because I thought, well, I've just made this up. I haven't written the book before. I've tried to structure a coherent argument, but is it? I don't know. And I know I live by these principles, but my life isn't necessarily an example for others to follow. And you're okay. It's quite noisy then. Can you possibly do that over there? And so I went out to conduct these interviews, and I worked with Alex so that I'd have an independent, intelligent person, smarter than I was, to help me really break down what it was that had taken place in organizations. So the argument that I make in the book, and I make that it's ultimately values-based decision-making that makes rule breaking okay, because there has to be this clear guiding principle to it. What I've learned since is in there, and you touched on it at the beginning, it was about the collective act and a sense of community and democracy. And what I really believe now, and I think there's lots of science and research that substantiates it, is around collective intelligence. So we know it was a fact when they were first doing this really good research, late 90s, and then it's followed up, I think, 2008, about diversity and equality. And it's shown that an all-male board, their cognitive, their convergent intelligence and divergent intelligence increases by about 20% when you add a woman onto the board. And at first this was seen as really breakthrough research, but then you realize the scientists realized it works exactly the other way. If you had an all-female board and introduced a male on it, or if you have an all-white board and introduce someone who's non-white, and it's the collective, there's the power of diversity amongst collective intelligence. And I didn't know these terms, I didn't know that research when you were reading the book. But what happens when you have that kind of what happens when you have that kind of pooled resource? You have that ability for radical candor. I'm sure you'll be familiar with that book. You have a group of smart people united around a problem they've got to solve. Yeah, morality, doing the right thing takes on a whole new meaning. And you must know this all the time, because very often we put projects into place when we have to overcome or fix the problems that we've had before. When you're working in a crew, as we would call it, when there is a clear challenge that you're setting out to face, when you are almost existing not above the rules, as in we're better than the rules, not beyond the need for rules, because you're in a state of flow. That idea of collective intelligence united around a set of principles, and in that stage, I think by and large, people tend to do the right thing. Now, of course, there are instances when people do the wrong thing, and I try to address that and get that right in the book. And I've actually been called out for my use of the word psychopaths and nutters, and what I was trying to present was ultimately I believe in humans being good, and humans wanting to be kind, and humans having a greater tendency to do the right thing than the wrong thing. And more often than not, when we work as a group, we do that even more. We police one another, other than, of course, some pretty difficult examples. But I was called out by one or two mental health campaigners that my terminology around a more psychopathic or sociopathic mindset was not right. So it's interesting what you learn along the way as well. But broadly, that's the area that I think and I've observed, and certainly when you look at organizations, when you've seen, there's a really great, there's a guy who was head of strategic project development at Salesforce. So really large process-driven project management. Actually, you could probably interview him. And he was charged with running the 3-month integration of Salesforce technology across Mercedes-Benz globally. So, you know, a very prestigious but antiquated company with very tightly controlled culture and project management controls coming out of Germany, and not to make, you know, general stereotypes of Germans, but an efficiency-driven organization. And the project went live just when lockdown happened. So it was a 3-year integration that now had to be delivered through a way that they'd never worked before. And so Owen called, actually he's referenced in the book, but the whole project we weren't allowed to talk about, but I can mention it here. And so the first thing they did was assemble as pirates. And the code that came out was to do the right thing. And that's a wonderful, you know, principle, because that means you have to trust others knowing what right is, not by themselves, which is where it could go wrong, but by the group. And then they determined the rules that they wanted to break. And the number one rule they wanted to break was to kill all meta work. So they got rid of pre-meets about the meeting. They got rid of post-meets about the meeting. They just made sure that the meeting itself was as good as it needed to be. And they went through the entire workflow, the whole Gantt system, and found everything that they would call meta work about the work, and just allowed in things that were the work. And you know what the result was? They delivered the project, that entire global integration, in 1.5 years. So the cost saving, the efficiency, the client relationship, and they did it all remotely. I mean, just goes to show. So, you know, I can talk about it in the esoteric rule-breaking form, doing the right thing, how do we stay on track? But when you see it, and people get very worried, and I still get approaches by companies going, can you talk about rule bending? We really like the ideas in the book, but can you stay away from the rule breaking stuff? When you trust a smart group of people, you really foster a space of psychological safety, collective intelligence, and making decisions around values. You know, it goes way beyond purpose, and it goes into real, it's surprising levels of productivity.
We have a question from Tanisha Himanshu.
Yes, we have a question. So the question Tanisha asks is, unless Tanisha, you want to ask yourself, I can.
Sure, I can do. I just I didn't want to forget it or interrupt. I have to be honest, I came across the book on Monday, and I've been listening to the podcast endlessly since. I just want some time to sit down and like read it properly. But I was just curious from your experience, in terms of what you mentioned around co-production and things like that, how do you find building allyship? I've been in a few positions before where it's been a lovely dream to have, and it's something I've tried to strive towards, but it's been difficult.
What a great question. Thank you very much. And thank you, and thank you for diving into the podcast, and great that you're here from Monday. I like that. I like the sense still, you know, for me, it's a really important thing to remember as an author that people come to this material fresh. And so for me, there's that initial, you know, the promise and the premise of the book. And then there's also now what I've got nearly 4 years of stories around it. So my personal experience from this is born of Livity, the organization that I referenced in the book. And I guess I didn't know I had my own awakening really as Livity, and my own naivety around the inequality that the systems that we're all in are based on. I grew up in a little pocket of South London. I went to a pretty rough school in a single parent household. I kind of thought I knew it all really. And it wasn't until I got to Livity and I started doing voluntary work in Kennington within the formal and informal youth services. And I was sat down and given a lecture by one of the youth workers around prejudice, around allyship, around racism. And it just, I don't know, began to really shift my perspective on how we do things. And obviously, because I've worked in local government and in youth programs, there's lots of unconscious bias training and allyship workshops, lots of things you can do. But the danger is it stays as a theoretical construct. And I get asked a lot, because I'm a middle class, white, man, by middle-class white men who struggle, particularly at the moment, with issues, or not issues around identity, but a narrative around identity. They find it very hard to say the right things. They often say nothing, which is the opposite of allyship, I think. And my reflection is that I was incredibly I was privileged. I was privileged for a second time, secondarily from my birth, by the work I did. And by the way, actually, the young people I work with in Brixton were predominantly young and black, predominantly male, and largely they'd been involved in the justice system or they'd been excluded from school. So that's not, that's a niche group in and of itself. But because we worked together for such a long time, because I think they sensed my absolute commitment and dedication and willingness to go the extra mile, I found myself in magistrates' courts, in people's homes, in hospital centres, everywhere really. And over time, and it has to be time, it's enough time, you can, what's the phrase, you walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And I began to see the world rather differently. And I was let into people's lives that I wouldn't have otherwise seen. And subsequently, I've come to understand this by a very wonky term, and it's known as, let's see if I can remember right, counterintuitive exemplars. But what that means is kind of like reverse role models. And it's seen and it's proven scientifically to be one of the most effective ways of breaking biases. So if you really want to break down a subconscious bias, it's incredibly hard to do. Unconscious bias training has lots of flaws. It's well intended, but lots of flaws. But if you actually want to do so, you need to spend time, and the research suggests about 2 years. So spending regular time violating your stereotypes, so actively with people that you would maybe disagree with, but you certainly have a very distant and different perspective on the world with. But over 2 years, spending regular time together, arguing, experiencing, and that can be cultural experiences to professional experiences, you begin to change your view of the world. And that's like, you actually can update your biases through this. So, this obviously appealed to me. This is the spirit of the book. This is about finding people, the whole point of the diverse crews that they had were based on their shared skills and their shared values and their sense of adventure and change. And it wasn't ever about recruiting in their own image or the ways that institutions fall into those kind of traps. And eventually you had these incredibly diverse of thought and experience and skills, these crews. And that's why they were so powerful and effective. And so now I find myself in a place where I don't use the word allyship particularly, but I think at a very deep level, I've shifted biases and gained perspectives. So when I'm asked about it, I think ultimately if someone's really invested in doing that kind of work, it's about spending time deeply involved with the communities or identities that you're interested in supporting long enough and committed enough that your biases around them, that you can be honest about those and that they will start to shift at a subconscious level. So it's not an easy answer, but I don't think there is an easy answer to this. And I think that's shown in the work. And when you see real allyship in place, it's because people share lives and experiences.
That's been really helpful. Do you mind if I piggyback on that a little bit? Is that okay?
Please do, yeah.
The 2 years timeline is quite interesting as well. And I was just wondering, so once you've got, I suppose, that community, I'm going to use allyship just so you know what I'm referring to, but I appreciate it's probably best to refer it to something else. But then when you take that into an institution, for example, how do you start gathering involvement on that side of things? Or at least what's your experience in that?
Yeah, well, I look for bridges and people that can bridge the gap. So this organization that I was just referring to, right? So it's a large financial services organization. It's about 2,000 employees. It's based in the middle of England. It has a very undiverse community. If we're talking about physical appearance levels of diversity, they're not really aware of what less seen forms of diversity they have. So they're a little behind the curve there, but they're really well intended. They're very vocal groups. They've very backed that. They've made diversity an absolute pillar of their work. So all the intentions there. But when I've now got to work with the kind of on the ground crews, and we're doing, being more part of the work we're doing, there's total disbelief. There's a huge disconnection. They can see that the bosses want it to work, right? But in a way, their narrative is undermining their objective because it's just not believable. They're saying this, and they've written it, it's perfectly written down. And when they're asked to speak on it, they can quote the exact sentiment. And so then I get to, so I'm very comfortable working with the call center people, local people from Birmingham, very comfortable speaking to the different diverse networks that have been established, I feel 100% at home and able to listen to their criticisms, share them, and gain them, even though I don't have any personal professional experience about what it means to be black from Birmingham working in a call center. But this is the real benefit of my life, I think, that I've become multilingual, because then I can go and sit in the boardroom with an all-white boardroom and only one female, and translate on behalf of people who feel unable to speak or be listened to in a way that these guys can get. Because like I said, the other end of it, and I get this approach quite a lot, there's a lot of well-intended senior white professionals who feel incredibly uncomfortable saying the right thing, don't know how to do it, and so they say less. And I can find that I can act as a conduit between these two groups and begin to, because the dichotomy of dishonesty in organizations is so hard, then people fall ingrained. So one end feels a lack of trust because this stuff's being said, but it's not being delivered. And over here, there's fear. And when you have fear versus a lack of trust, no matter what banner is on the wall or what initiative's been promoted, you know, we're humans. And so we pick up on intrinsic signals as much as anything else. So by being able to have a really honest, implicit conversation about what was going on, we managed to move groups explicitly closer together. And that's a bit of work that I really like to do. So I think you need connectors when you're talking about institutional change, and then you need connectors to bring individuals together. So there were two members of the board who I thought were a bit more willing to take a risk, and there was one group that I thought was way more able to understand the perspective of the people on the board, and we got them together. We facilitated a further conversation, and they've committed now to spending regular time together without it always being in a diversity or allyship pressured environment, but just getting out of the office, going to meet clients, you know, having lunch, doing the stuff where you'll build connections. Because I think that's it. It's a human problem. It's a human solution. And when we over strategize it, sometimes we don't create the safe spaces needed to overcome it.
It's been so valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. The cleaner's in with a very good question to build on that.
Yes,
go for it. Yeah.
Yes, actually, I have a diversity and inclusion question, because I look at what my company is doing, and they're very accommodating in terms of disabilities. Like just recently, I was diagnosed with Asperger's and things like that. And they do ask about how can they accommodate me and my work and so on. And I try to ask these questions our clients as well, possibly companies that we work with, and most of the time I get, we make sure that we hire 30% of women, and you know, they usually channel women into these traditionally people-focused sort of jobs, and I heard some the other day, so you're a female, you would do in business because you understand people. And then I thought, oh gosh, not really. so it's sometimes I feel like it's just a statement. It's an empty statement with some metrics behind it. How would you address that, or how would you give examples of diversity and inclusion initiatives?
I think you're right. I think very often it is a statement, and I think you could put a lot of things into that statement. I think diversity will be one. I think a lot of stuff around purpose. I've also mentioned, you know, work around resilience and well-being, and you can really tell the difference in organizations that mean it and those where it is more of a statement. And I think the difference there is based on who's designed it and who's delivering it. So we've probably all seen organizations where the face of diversity is like a junior employee and perhaps one of their few diverse employees, and what that does very often puts the or seems to put the responsibility for diversity on that individual. And that is really messed up. You know, someone becomes the poster for diversity, and in a non-diverse organization, then that person's failing and that isn't their responsibility. You know, things get really dangerous pretty quickly. The same, you know, who hasn't been in an organization that says it champions creativity? And I'm widening this out because I think your point is right. These are esoteric, abstract concepts often used by companies, and without a full dimensional strategy to back it up. We're not changing the rules, we're just labeling it something else. So just to put it into its widest frame, but I can come back to diversity specifically as well, but I think there's use in this. you call it creativity, but no one's ever been in an organization where creativity really gets structurally rewarded. Conformity is what structurally gets rewarded. That's how you get an advancement, not by challenging. You know, we get told to try new things and fail, but I've never met a manager who will give someone a bonus once they fail 10 times. You won't have your job if you fail 10 times, you know. Yet that's Google's law of failure. You only have one breakthrough success after every 9 failures, or out of 10 attempts. So, you know, is all of that a lie, therefore? Well, no, it can be well intended, but I think our job as pirates is to champion the spirit of change. So great, we've got a diversity program. What does it mean? Who designed it? You know, not even the metrics. I think you're right. Let's not get caught up in, because the schools, you know, we come up with schools, I think, as a well-intended attempt to be accountable for delivery, but then we become deliverable to the metrics, and we get, you know, there's a huge problem there. So I would look for design in co-production, as I've mentioned. And if people who've had a difficult time, people who represent diverse voices and not just physical, obvious or surface level diversity, but real diversity of background experience, there's a huge advancement, I think, in the conversation around neurodiversity at the moment. But again, it will be surface for a while. These things are always surface for a while. So who's designed it and what's the outcome? And then also, where do the decisions get made? So if, and I've seen this in some cultural institutions have done quite good work on this, they've either created a diversity shadow board. So if youth is an area of diversity that people are trying to address, there's been a youth board. Okay, that's really impressive. Does the board have decision-making power? Yes, okay, that's impressive. Does it have voting rights on budget? Oh, okay, well, that's fallen down then. So it has to be through the line. So who's designed it, who makes the decisions, and who has the kind of final say on the matters of most importance. And if there isn't diverse representation at each and every one of those levels, then it's going to fall foul, no matter how well intended, of it not being systematic. And systematic means we're not looking in a year or 2 years saying, well, here was our percentage of increase of women or people from a different background. It'll be, this is the way the organization makes its decisions, and this is the way the organization spends its money. Because that's really, you know, how organizations live and exist. And metrics can be a front for those things. And I've seen really great work being done. There is an amazing young pirate, and she runs a firm called Sour Lemons, and it's about training young people to be producers, based on the instance, of course, of you know, you turning lemons into lemonade. And when she gets taken on, because she's an incredibly intelligent, incredibly articulate young Black woman who's had, you know, really, you know, if she would challenge me if I said she had a challenging life, she would say she has profound lived experience. And then she will get invited onto boards. She'll sit on boards. She'll help recruit a team of diverse young decision makers. And then she'll get that organization to back them like the future talent they are. And that means recognizing the power of lived experience. That means creating decision-making environments. And she doesn't stop. And so when you see an organization go that far, you begin to believe that they're going to do something lasting about it.
And I would like to add to your point about learning languages, because what the book really changed about me, or my perception, is the sort of pirates and their influence, because I perceived pirates as of Jack Sparrow is the first thing that came up to my mind. But I talked with my friends just randomly. I said, I'm reading a book about pirates, how to be more pirate. And then we started talking about Barbarossa. Yes. And in our Western literature, he's covered as of, yes, it's an influential figure, but in the Muslim world, he's kind of described as a righteous one, and the one that was just very powerful. And I think that really contrasts the Western maybe perception of inheritance of power, because power would be inherited through generations. So he's actually celebrated in Turkey or in Muslim countries as of, I think he saved the Jews from the Spanish Inquisition or something like that. Yeah. So we just had a brief conversation, but I would like to get to know that history just a bit more depth. The book inspired me to do so.
So I'm just looking up the, I want to look up the particular gangster who I wanted to reference. There we go. I think these are part. Why is it that we are so unfaithful to the morality that we have when it comes to pirates and gangsters, you know, and there's something about that willful swagger that we all want a bit of in a world so wrapped up in rules that seem like they're there just to hold us back. We all want to have the cutlass or the pistol or the bragado that's going to allow us to find our way through it. And so I think there is a bit of our shadow side of all of us that, you know, has been there just wishing we could pull a gun on our frustrated room, right? It would be non-human to not have those kind of frustrations or fantasies. And then when aspects of those stories connects with a spirit of help and support and camaraderie and community and social justice, then it gets really interesting because morality gets blurred. And I think that's really says a lot about the moment we're in, because, you know, we're in a space where morality is up against legality very often. And, you know, we know how endemic corruption is. You know, we're in the middle of a World Cup, and you know, the role of FIFA seems very, very clear and incredibly corrupt. The underbelly of capitalism is informal economies that prop capitalism up. They wouldn't work without one another. And we wouldn't have so much of the innovations we've seen without pirates. And then when we hear the good that they did, I mean, you know, that's what's so delightfully confusing and morally ambiguous about the whole thing. But I also think it's why those spirits are so important to us. And, you know, some of certainly the UK's pirates run deep in the UK, as does Robin Hood. You know, Robin, pirates, you couldn't have it like Jack Sparrow. Yes, everybody's opinion of pirates comes from Disney. Disney's done an awfully good job on Robin Hood, as have many other movie studios. Yet, if you were to contemporize Robin Hood or Barbossa or any of them, you know, they wouldn't look so good. My children have done dozens of pirate-themed birthday parties. They've never once been to a Pablo Escobar party. I mean, that would be outrageous, wouldn't it? But, you know, arguments are made, and strongly made, of the good and the community's support and societal ties and various, you know, anti-establishment rhetoric of Escobar. So I think it gets into a really good and interesting space. I think these characters are useful to live, you know, and learn close to, because I think it pushes us towards our own sense of morality. And when legality is under question, our morality is going to come even more important. And when you saw, you know, in the pandemic, community becomes all important. You know, when infrastructure begins to shake and creak, and as many suspect it will do, either with economic instability or climate instability, that sense of community and what it means is going to be all important. And let's really invest on knowing what the morality is going to be then, and how we will work that together. Because, you know, we have to accept that as humans we are blurred and flawed, and we will need flawed and imperfect leaders with a great sense of morality in moments like those. So yeah, I'm very keen on you exploring that particular line of thought, and I'd like to hear what you learn about him.
It's actually Barbarossa. My friend was from that sort of Middle Eastern part of the world. He told me that Barbarossa actually would make kings in Europe. He would make kings tremble in Europe, and that's why the name of Operation Barbarossa is actually it's supposed to convey fear, and that's why it was chosen to describe the operation.
Really?
Yes, that's his perception, but I think there is a connection there. So yeah.
Lomo's asked Bob Ross. No, Barbarossa. Barbarossa is a famous and fearful pirate. His character is referenced and comes up regularly in the Pirates of the Caribbean. And Pirates of the Caribbean does have some accurate historic parts of the context. And Barbarossa was, I mean, the whole thing comes down to economics, really. It's the conquistadors, the Spanish invasion of Latin America, particularly Aztec Mexico, and the discovery of gold there. Barbarossa makes a deal with Cortez, Hernando Cortez, about the Spanish gold. Cortez devises this way of getting the gold back to Spain, which is where the pieces of 8 come from. It was a measure of gold that you could then quantify, protect, and you could then ship in vast quantities. So that's why Pieces of Eight came into being as well. And these two men, like, I mean, the apocalypse that they wrought across the indigenous population was well known through guns and germs and steel. But yeah, those decisions that took place, because then they funded the empire and the Spanish Inquisition and everything that came with it, which had terrifying aspects to it. But I never knew that Operation Barbarossa is Hitler's famous advance into Russia, which very nearly won the Second World War. But it was then his overexertion led to his ultimate defeat. So Barbarossa's influence, once again, thank you so much. That is a brilliant story of pirate influence that I did not know. I shall be telling that in my very next Female Pirate Talk.
Thank you for that. One question before we move on, and actually I think it kind of stems from this. Both Nick and I are advocates and ambassadors of a movement called Responsible Project Management. And there is a very wonderful idea in the book about avoiding mindless growth, but scaling. Could you expand that a little bit, and what does that mean for people like us in that context?
Yeah, I struggle with this as an entrepreneur, and then I struggle with it as a business owner, and then as a consultant, because I couldn't quite understand why, when I'd only ever got into businesses and into work to try and make a difference in the world and to try to help people. And I was reminded the other day, my naivety of the kind of the true motivation for most organizations. When my first ever business as a social enterprise operating in South London, trying to provide equal opportunities for young people. And a business consultant had come to visit us, and she asked us what our exit strategy was. And I showed her the fire escape. And she thought I was joking. And I thought she was joking. So what else can an exit strategy be? And lo and behold, over the years, I began to realize that most organizations and entrepreneurs start their enterprises to one day exit them. And so therefore their multiplier and valuation determines nearly every choice they make along the way. And therefore their project management systems, recruitment systems, and everything else are geared towards profitability. And therefore you begin to understand how this whole thing works and why I felt so at odds with it. So once I realized that, I started to interview entrepreneurs who'd done that and been successful. And I never found happy ones, ever. Once, someone bought a yacht and they took their family around the world. Every other entrepreneur I ever met just waited 2 years of gardening leave and then started pretty much the same business under a different guise, because we do these things for love, and they're an expression of who we are, and we're creating in the world to answer solutions. So that was my entrepreneurial beginning of an understanding of growth for the sake of growth. And then the more you push into it, you find it obviously in business, and the way that businesses are structured, and the way that businesses are then ultimately decisions are made by a group of shareholders who might become quite distant to the business. And then you go into this place where growth for the sake of growth, medically described, is the definition of cancer. I think I was talking about that in the book. And that simply can't be the way of the world. When I wrote the book, I think Earth Overshoot Day was the end of August. And that's the day that all the resources on Earth are used up, and we shouldn't use another resource based on the number of people we are. End of August. This year, I think it was August the 7th. So it's moving forward rapidly. And so this idea of growth for growth's sake seems to then become not just problematic, but probably almost, pardon me, I think we're going to look back on that as a human rights issue, because it's the same groups of people and same geographies that will be disproportionately affected by the negative outputs of consumerism. And you've got to look to where the exhaust pipe is. And yes, there could be a stronger set of policies around negative consequences of rampant and extractive consumerism and capitalism. But you just got to look at the way firms are organized. And that's it. Every firm is built for scale, growth. Growth is always universally accepted as a good thing. And to even talk about degrowth, you'd be largely laughed at in most even progressive capitalist and entrepreneurial circles. And yet there has to be another way, because we're running out of road. And so, at least when I found those groups, you found like, oh, look, here's a smart, intelligent, positive view on capitalism and how we might grow within it, or what growth begins to look like. And I increasingly, I'm still very much with this argument, and rather than I used to feel a bit embarrassed or nervous or lacking in an economic understanding, or naive, or because I thought exiting a business seemed a bit daft, there's a really strong body of work that's revolving around it. And I don't know what other books you've looked at this, but I'm very inspired by Kate Raworth's work and Donut Economics by Jason Hickel. I think the argument for degrowth won't work just because it's framed in such a negative statement, but I really think there's some very, very interesting ideas. And I think it's interesting where regenerative leadership, regenerative project management comes into play here as well. But I think and I still believe this, it's where it's in the engine room of business that the change is going to have to come from, because it's in the engine room that we're going to determine what the output is.
Thank you, Sam, for that. And I realize that we're just about over time. Any parting thoughts for us? I know you said that you were going to recommend a book as well for us.
Yeah, a couple of things. I think as I said, and not everyone knows, the book began as a very boring book around purpose and the heart of the businesses and the organizations that we run. Since How to Be More Pirate, I think my conclusion is thus, that the number one rule in businesses that I think needs to be broken is our problems with transparency. And the grown-up version of purpose that we're facing, and probably actually to draw some of the strands together, the grown-up version of diversity as well, will just be transparency. And when we get to a place when organizations are 100% transparent, like transparent in the way that, I don't know, very few things you can really think of are, in kind of the way that blockchain promised, but that's obviously riddled with problems at the moment. But where you can see every decision and every transaction is available, then I think we'll transcend these. What was the way that? It was rather brilliantly said. Yes, the diversity, inclusion, purpose will all stop being abstract concepts, because if we can break the rules that inhibit the transparency that we want, then you won't have inequality. You won't have the negative outputs, you won't have the dangerous, flawed carbon offsetting. Truly transparent organizations will be project managed in a very different way, and they'll have a profoundly different impact. And then on a personal note, the thing that I've most observed when the rules that need to be broken are the rules against our own self-limiting beliefs. Fundamentally, it's the rules against our own limitations. And I've seen incredible things that people have done. And they may be large or small, but they're subjective to everyone's own realities, context, and the levers that they have within their power to pull. But the main reason that people aren't doing it, there's nothing, I'm still really very proud of being a pirate and the strands of history that I've drawn together, but there's nothing in there that's, was a complete mystery. But what it does, it seems to me, is it gives people an opportunity. And this is, I mentioned it in How to Be a Pirate, but the one word proxy that pirate is, or be more pirate is people giving themselves permission. And that permission enables people to get past that limitation, the number one rule we all need to break, because it's the one rule that tells us that we can't do what it is that our heart wants to do. So yeah, in organizations, transparency, and in individuals, the rebellion needs to be against our own self-imposed limitations.
Thanks a lot, Sam. Thanks very much for joining us.
Sorry, my book recommendation would be a book called Citizens. And it's by John Alexander. I reference it in Be More Pirate.
Yes.
Oh, there, you've got it there. Right, great. So you see, it's marvelous. He's on tour at the moment, but I can give you an introduction to him if you'd like. He's now completed. He just had that 3-pillar diagram when I first met him, and he gave me that backstory of pirates and the role that they played in the formation of democracy. But he's made it into such an incredible, coherent argument. And it's so thoughtful, and he hasn't applied it to business, but I think it really can be. From a project management, it's like I think it's the update to agility and non-hierarchical units.
Thanks a lot for that. And by the way, this slide was put together by Nick, so it's he knew that you were going to talk about this. But no, thanks once again, and thank you everyone for joining us. this has been wonderful. This book has actually taught us a lot. Nick, would you like to say anything?
No, I'm very thankful actually. I love the history itself, and I did start reading it with a negative point of view because I'm always thinking, can you scale this up or not? And you did move to Airbnb and Fairbnb and all that, and the fact that sometimes a business displaces another business and then it just takes over the power thing. But the cooperative element is quite strong, and that I think is a very nice book to enthuse people. And the fact that you have inspired other books like this one, for example, shows that there is collective knowledge that is being created, which itself I think is translating slowly into a better capitalism. I think is probably what we're trying to say. And I cannot just take out of my mind the Allende part of your wife's name in this case, because I think there are certain principles there. You talk about principles and pragmatism. That confused me a bit because I thought the principles on their own were enough, but the pragmatic element is what I am learning very much from this book. Thank you very, very much. And the audience was good, and we did practice collective questioning. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll stop the recording.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you,